Buenos dias, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Monica Byrne Jimenez from Indiana University. Now, I guess, officially past president. And as is the tradition, the past president introduces the past president as they give their speech. It's a moment of joy for both of us. I'm going to give the typical traditional introduction to Dr. April Peter Hawkins, and then I'm going to take my privilege as the one introducing her to just share some of my own introduction with her. So Dr. Peter Hawkins earned her BS from Northwestern, as is evident whenever she sees purple and white, and her MSW from Columbia University. And she is very proud that Columbia is 6-1 now and tied for the Ivy League.
All right.
That's real football. She got her PhD from the Ohio State University. From the Ohio State University. No, for April, I will say she got her PhD from the Ohio State University. In ed policy and leadership, she's worked in K-12 contexts in several capacities. She began teaching in an urban middle school in New Jersey, founding faculty member of North Star Academy Charter School of Newark. I did not know that. I know the principal, one of the principals. Okay, we'll talk about that later. And she considers that experience to be life-changing, and I would assume that her experience as president this year has also been life-changing. At North Star, she serves as a school social worker and dean of students. When she finished her PhD, she became principal of a high school. She started in a district small school reform initiative in Baltimore. she has spent 12 years of her career in academia. She spent the first 10 at the University of Georgia. While there, she served for the Dean's Council for Diversity, and she served as the College Education Faculty Senate President. While at UGA, Dr. Peters Hawkins continued to engage with K-12 practitioners, served 4 years as a consultant for the Institute of Student Achievement in the Atlanta Public Schools. Currently, April is the Associate Department Chair and Associate Professor of Educational Administration in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at the University of Houston. Go Cougs! See, I'm getting down with it. Her research interests include examining the ways that districts provide mentoring and support for early career administrators, women in school leadership and urban school reform, effective university district partnerships, and leadership development. She's been published in the Journal of School Leaders, Teachers College Record, Leadership and Policy in Schools, Journal of Ed Admin, International Journal of Qualitative Studies, Urban Education, and ... In addition to serving as president and member of the UCA Executive Committee, April served as the 2016 Division A Program Chair of AERA. Impressive. But that's only part of the story. And I think, I'm not going to take very long. I think one of the things that at the International Summit, we had 2 Indigenous scholars, and they both started their presentations by introducing us to their families. Because we bring our families with us. We all make decisions to leave our families at home and come do our professional work. And yet we all carry our families with us. And I think that's really an important part. And I think we need to recognize that as sort of entire, complete human beings. And we all carry our families in our hearts when we come. What's been absolutely marvelous about being with April these past couple years is that most of the time, April brings her family for reals. And I think, Aiden and Avery are just adorable. But it's more than that. It's how she's able to not only, protect that sacred time that happens when we're together as family, but she's also pushed the way that we as an organization define family. We often say, UCA is our family. And that's true. And yet it could be our family plus. And so having April, share her family, be gracious, Dr. Dr. Hawkins in the back there, who's been amazing, and has been such an important part of, obviously, April, but is an important part of our experience as an EC. Aiden and Avery, again, we've seen them grow before they knew what they were. And she has shared that experience with us. And I think that's a testament of leadership, when people can, with authenticity and integrity, combine their personal and their professional, and then invite other people to participate in that as well. So I honor and value and appreciate that about April, in addition to all her academic accolades, all her leadership skills, and then just the wonderful person that she is. So please help me welcome our 2017 presidential address giver, Dr. Peters Hawkins.
If I was inclined to sing, I would invoke Etta James and sing At Last. Good morning. Monica, thank you so much for that really wonderful introduction. Being on the EC, we are colleagues, but we've also become friends and family, and so I really appreciate those warm words. Thank you. So I'm going to jump right in because I timed this thing, and we're going to be pushing to the end, I think, unless I talk really fast, which sometimes I have a tendency to do. So, I kind of need the clicker, huh? So the title of my talk is Reclaiming Our Time, Thoughts on Enacting Elements of Moral Leadership in the Current Political Climate. And before we get really into this, I know some of you really like social media, so you know the UCEA traditional hashtag. We started this thing this year of hashtag Denver in November. And I'm on Twitter in case you want to tag me on any of these things, and there's my Twitter handle. Okay, and so by way of just showing you the agenda, I'll do some acknowledgments. We've already had the welcome. I want to talk about the purpose of how I came to the purpose of this talk. And in that, I'll talk about who I am. We'll have a discussion a little bit about the current and social and political context, an even briefer conversation about the current context of schools, but it's relevant. I think they're related. And then some of the meat of what I want to say about moral leadership, and then we'll conclude. So first, acknowledgments. So first of all, I must acknowledge the Divine One who is the head of my life. I am blessed, humbled, and grateful. All that I have is due to divine grace and favor. I'm thankful for each mountain, valley, trial, and triumph. My heart beats in eternal gratitude. I also really need to thank so many individuals who have been a light unto my path in some way along this journey. This might take a while, but I actually need to take the time to distribute the proverbial flowers, as my mother would say. So I'm going to start by thanking the teachers in my life who made it look fun and easy to be a teacher, who knew their craft well and who truly cared about me. And they're not here with us today. I mean, they're here in the earth realm, but they're not with us, but they should be acknowledged. So thank you to Sister Christine Crooks, who was my very first teacher other than my mother, first grade. The late Clementine Young, who was my 6th grade reading teacher. When I pretended with my dolls to teach, I pretended that I was Miss Young. To David Larry Jones, who was my 8th grade English teacher, to Mr. Don Neal, who was my 9th grade English teacher, to Gloria Hampton Merceuse, who was my 9th and 10th grade Spanish teacher, and to my soror, Myra Mitchell, who was my high school phys ed teacher. These people represent elementary through high school, and all of these educators made an indelible impact upon my life. And while I had very few teachers of color during my entire K-12 educational career and beyond, they are all African American. I could see me in them, and for that I'm grateful. Along my own journey within academia, I've also been blessed to interact with some powerful, smart scholars and colleagues. You've each encouraged my thinking and influenced me in some way. And I want to start by thanking the sister scholars I met when I first began the journey. So I went digging in the files. You often encouraged me and talked me off the ledge. So to Latish Reed and Patrice McClellan, Sonia Douglas Horsford, Lisa Bass, Cosette Grant Overton, Karen Beard, Gaetan Jean-Marie, Laura McNeil, Dana Thompson Dorsey, and my friend since the beginning, some of people say my day one, Shanika Williams. Thank you. I also need to thank my colleagues from the University of Houston, so go Cougs. It's refreshing to work in a space where every colleague is committed to social justice, to being collegial, to disagreeing without being disagreeable, to the growth and success of our students, to the growth and success of our degree programs, and to the partnerships we've cultivated within the local context. I landed in a great place, go Cougs. I'm also honored to thank the previous UCEA leaders who were pioneers in their own way. It is upon your shoulders we stand. And so many of you have been gracious enough to come and share some warm, encouraging words with me, and I thank you for that. But I'd like to name you. So thank you to past presidents Martha McCarthy, Pedro Reyes, Malu Gonzalez, Michael Dantley, James Koshurik, Alan Shoho, and Noel Witherspoon Arnold. And I named them specifically because they were pioneering just in terms of the space that they occupy and their identity and breaking through some of the barriers to get into leadership in this organization. I also want to thank some of the veteran scholars who've provided support and mentoring to me in some way. So thank you to my advisor from The Ohio State University, Cynthia Uline, to Steve Jacobson, to Linda Skurla, to Gary Crow. And I didn't say this in the plenum when I acknowledged that she had been the longest serving plenum rep, but to Allison Borden, who was my very first plenum partner, thank you. And a special thank you to the elders, the giants who've paved the way for people like me. So first of all, to Cynthia Tyson, who, although her work is not specifically in educational leadership, she was my first mentor as a doctoral student. Like the other mentors I list, she cared about me as a person, as a Black woman, and as a scholar, and I'm indebted to her. To the other elders and mentors upon whose shoulders we stand, a heartfelt thank you as well to the late Barbara Jackson, to the late Lynn Foster, to Dr. Kofi Lomote, to Dr. Linda Tillman, to Dr. Judy Alston, and Dr. Kuala Matata, and many others. Thank you to Michelle Young. You know, at University of Houston, our nickname is the Powerhouse. And professors there are referred to as powerhouse faculty. And this term is more than appropriate to describe Michelle Young. Michelle is definitely a powerhouse leader. Michelle, it has been a privilege and a pleasure to work with you over the years. I also want to acknowledge and thank the UCEA headquarters staff who seem so calm and poised in the middle of all the frenzy of convention planning and everything else that we do as an organization. You are the backbone of the organization in a very real way. And a special shout out to Angel Nash, who has kept me on point this entire conference and had me where I need to be. Thank you. To all the other members of the EC with whom I've worked both currently and over the years, you've contributed invaluably to my growth within this organization. And I'd like to name you, so Chris Bruner, Cindy Reed, Pam Tucker, Sarah Dexter, Andrea, it's my little thing for her, Noel Witherspoon Arnold, Gerardo Lopez, Liz Hollingworth, Casey Cobb, Monica Byrne Jimenez, President Mariela Rodriguez, President-elect Tara Van Zandt Chambers, and my big brother, who's actually 2 days younger than me, and he is my older son's godfather, Mark Gooden. It's been a pleasure serving with each of you. I'd like to also thank my graduate assistant, Miranda Wilson, who's not here but assisted me with gathering research and reviewing previous presidential addresses in preparation for today's talk. And before I get to thanking my family, I just want to say it's dangerous to name people, right? So here's what I want to do. If you read something I wrote, if I read something you wrote, if you cited something I wrote, if I cited something you wrote, if we're Facebook friends and you liked a comment I made, or I liked a comment you made, if you tweeted something I posted, if I retweeted something you sent out, if you are here in this room today, thank you. That should just cover it. Nobody should say you left me out. Last and most significantly, I have to acknowledge my family. So my mother is here with us in Denver. She's in the back with my younger son. Mom, just raise your hand. I learned my first leadership lessons from her, and I continue to do so. She's a K-12 educator. She's passionate about serving vulnerable students. incredibly passionate. I never thought I'd hear my mother say she's going to retire. Like, I thought she'd just work and work and work. And because she's just so passionate about what she does. So I honor your presence, Mom, and I thank you for all the life lessons. Additionally, I acknowledge my sons, Aiden Joseph Bickham Hawkins. That's Halloween. And Avery Liam Hunter Hawkins. And if you look, the picture on the left is Aiden, and the picture on the right is Avery. They're both too young to understand what Mommy is doing. I learned that a lot this week. But assuredly, they will be taught lessons about leadership throughout their lives, much as my parents did with me. I am thankful to be the vessel privileged to bring them forth into this realm, and I love you guys. Finally, I must thank my best friend, my prayer partner, my confidant, my role model, my husband. Dr. Billy Hawkins is the quintessential scholar. Like, I hope to be like him one day. I don't think it's possible, but I might try. He sets the bar high as an academician and a role model. He is conscious, or as some of us say, woke. He's highly productive, he's pensive. Believe it or not, he's really funny. And although he has a quiet demeanor, he's a strong advocate. I admire all these qualities, and I'm blessed to have you by my side as we walk this leg of the journey of life together. And Billy is also in the back. Just wave your hand, Billy. And a couple of these photos were actually taken at conferences. Okay, so let me talk about the purpose of this talk. At the time that I decided to run for UCEA president, several things were different for me personally, professionally, and politically. Nearly 2 years later, as I exit the presidency, things are profoundly different. So I'd like to invoke the words of Outkast. You can plan a pretty picnic, but you can't predict the weather. Their use of the word picnic and its racist origins aside, these poets remind us that things change, and often this change is due to elements outside of our control. What a difference a year or two makes. Personally, in a year's time, I've become a mother again. We welcomed our younger son, Avery, into our family in June. Yes, so we're not getting sleep yet. Professionally, in August, after serving only 1 year at the University of Houston, as program director for the EDD, I have taken on the role of associate department chair in the midst of a number of changes in our department. And politically, over a year ago, prior to assuming the role of UCEA president officially, I assumed that the next occupant of the White House would be a woman who, while in many ways considered problematic, was qualified to be president. And finally, and probably most importantly, I was really looking forward to delivering this speech on the sun-kissed, balmy Isle of Puerto Rico. We'll get there in 2020, so it's okay. But much has changed. So as I reflect on the organization and our mission of promoting, sponsoring, and disseminating research on the essential problems of schooling and leadership practice, improving the preparation and professional development of educational leaders and professors, and positively influencing local, state, and national educational policy, I'm compelled to reflect for a few moments on how we can accomplish this mission in the current social and political context. It is my belief that moral leadership is key to our ability to reclaim our time, so to speak. So who am I? Let me say that I don't position myself as an expert on these topics, and for many of you who are daily engaged in the work of emancipatory research and resistance, you will hopefully hear a message that affirms your thinking, but more than anything, it reflects my endeavor to speak my truth to power. So I recognize this is not everybody's truth, but it is my truth. So who am I to be talking to you about this topic? Well, obviously this is my last official duty, so I was looking for an escape route, but they told me I have to do it. But more than that, I want to speak about my subject position. And my aim is to share my thoughts about the political context and its influence on leadership in general, on educational leadership specifically, and the imperative for advocacy and reclaiming what is ours for those of us who desire to be on the right side of right. However, I do this through the filter of my identity. So again, who am I? I'm glad you asked. Well, I'm an African-American, married, heterosexual female. I'm the oldest of 3 girls. I'm a third-generation college graduate, and I say that with an asterisk because while that is true, I'm also the product of one grandparent who was a domestic worker. So there's a lot of different layers to this, but I'm not the first person in my family to go to college. I was born and raised in the Northeast. I know you didn't hear anything in my accent. But I've spent a large portion of my life in the Midwest and in the South. I was raised in a home with both my parents and a younger sister. We were a working-class family with middle-class values. At times, we lived in poverty, but it was a silent existence. It wasn't something that you could recognize by looking at us, and it wasn't consistent throughout my life, so it was an interesting set of circumstances. We were never we never qualified for free or reduced lunch, so you wouldn't have been able to track us that way. Initially, when things were good, my mother was a stay-at-home mom. My parents made this choice that would assure them about our safety and well-being, and we could afford it, so my mother stayed at home. And I attended an all-black private school during some of these formative years. And I want to say, as a caveat there, that that school was an interesting place because I learned a lot about racial pride and history and confidence in myself. I didn't learn about racism and structural oppression until I left and went to an integrated setting. While I was there, it was a very different experience. I skipped 2 grades at that school. It was a profound experience and it's shaped my being probably more than I know. But I'm thankful to have had a space to learn in that was affirming and instilled confidence and racial pride in me. When I left that context to attend public school, my experience was the complete and total opposite, and I'm going to share a story about that just shortly. But I want to use this experience as a starting point for the discussion. So I went to that school for 1st grade. I went to public school for 2nd grade. I skipped kindergarten. I went to that school 1st grade, public school 2nd grade, back to the private school for a couple years, and then back to the public school. So when I went back to public school for good, I was placed in the bottom reading and math classes. And this was done when we were openly tracking students. Some of y'all remember that. You tested into like the Bluebirds or the Ravens or whatever. And some of us in the room, I said we're old enough to remember this, the public school admitted me into my appropriate grade. So by this time, although I've been skipped twice, per my parents' request, for social rather than academic reasons, I was placed in my correct age-appropriate grade. But they never tested me. So the only thing I had in common with my classmates, in addition to race, was the neighborhood we lived in. And in the community in which I grew up, there were 2 apartment complexes. I lived in one of them. Everybody else was homeowners. It was like the school officials looked at my address and my race and made a decision about my intellectual capacity. So I'm thankful for 2 things during this time. First, I'm thankful I spoke up. I went home early in the experience and I told my mother, I don't think I'm in the right class. I thought the work was really easy. Secondly, I'm thankful for a mother who listened and went up to the school. My mother asked me if they had tested me, and I told her they had not, and they just assigned me a class by looking at me, basically. So she went to the school and made them test me. As a result of testing, I went from the bottom to the top. So how could the school do that to me? How did the teacher not notice that I was in the wrong place? What would have happened to me if I hadn't said anything? What would have happened if my mother didn't go and advocate for me? My academic career would certainly be extremely different, and I learned a great deal about oppressive structures and forces schools embrace and replicate during my early days in public school. These experiences have served as the foundation of the passion that I have for dismantling such structures and for providing support to social justice-oriented leaders in such spaces. This is my way of reclaiming our time. So let's talk about reclaiming our time. Some of y'all know that term has been recently made popular by Congresswoman Maxine Waters. When I saw this video clip that went viral, I actually have the link there, but I don't think we're going to have time to show it. I don't think. Sorry. Show it. There's a hot link on that page. Can you just click it? Huh? And I'll show. That's just the meme, but the actual YouTube link is there, if you can get to it. It's not gonna. Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, but I was actually taken at her use of this phrase to thwart Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin's attempts to sidestep answering her direct questions concerning his failure to respond to a direct letter from her during a House Financial Services Committee meeting. In fact, video of her uttering this phrase went viral. An article in the Washington Post states, quote, "For many women and people of color, the phrase reclaiming my time felt particularly poignant with the idea of reclamation specifically speaking to both the present and the past that allowed it to be read by many as a powerful overturning of a system usually used to keep her and those like her in their place. Rather than continuing to cede the floor to others, reclaiming my time signaled that it was the moment for Waters and maybe all of us to take our power back. And I'm reminded of a session I was in where we were talking about as women of color scholars being silenced. And this just sort of speaks to that and a number of other things. So Maxine Waters said, reclaiming my time, and my title is Reclaiming Our Time. And I use the pronoun our in reclaiming our time to invoke notions of collective responsibility necessary in order to dismantle oppressive structures. So how exactly do we reclaim our time? I hope to unpack that further in this talk, but first I want to set a foundation for this notion by sharing a thought from the movie Marshall about Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Now, you all probably know Marshall's job as an NAACP lawyer was to serve as defense counsel for clients who were being tried or targeted because of their race. There's a scene in the movie, though, where Thurgood Marshall and his co-counsel, Sam Friedman, are walking down the courthouse steps after a day of court where a black man is being tried for raping a white woman. And in this scene, Marshall tells Friedman, this is almost a direct quote, I was so struck by this quote, he says, "The Constitution was not written for us, but we will make it work for us. It's ours now." So specifically, I hope this example helps to clarify what I mean by the word our and the phrase reclaiming our time. And I'm referring to time and space that was not established for us, but that we have made work for us, so it's ours now. We are reclaiming it. As moral leaders operating in spaces characterized by structural and systemic oppression, we are always already reclaiming our time. And to bring this home, I want to pose a similar notion about leadership. You all probably know the first studies of leadership led to the development of the great man theories. Great man theory excluded everyone who was not wealthy, white, and male. Subsequent theories and studies of leadership were at times exclusive as well. In many ways, the idea of leadership was not written for us. And by us, I mean the beautiful us that is diverse in identity, philosophy, values, and thoughts. And it wasn't written for the constituents we serve, but it is ours now. In an article entitled Moral Leadership Shifting the Management Paradigm, Michael Dantley states, quote, "It is actively immoral for school leaders to attempt to embrace any genre of administration without first grappling with the social, political, and cultural contexts in which their schools exist. And in the current political context, we need a leadership framework that is responsive to our collective needs and goals, even if we must take that which was not created for us and reclaim it as ours." So let's talk about the current political context. I must say that as a black woman and the mother of 2 black sons, the current political context frightens me, and I'm going to speak more to that in just a second. It is jarring, though, that so much bias is sanctioned by those occupying some of the highest leadership positions in the land. In the current social and political context, racism, sexism, classism, ableism, homophobia, and many other forms of bias exist and contribute to structural oppression. These structures are so implicit that we often don't even recognize them. We need to be reclaiming our time. In the current social and political context, we observe leaders ignore the practice of political correctness and basic civility. In this context, social media has become a platform for commentary and critique. Whether this comes from the individual occupying the highest leadership role in the land, or from keyboard warriors hiding behind the anonymity of a computer monitor and a clever screen name, it seems as a society we have lost our care and concern for the impact of our words on others. We need to be reclaiming our time. In this current social and political context, white supremacists have been called very fine people. And professional football players and other athletes, many of whom are black, who exercise their constitutional First Amendment right to protest, sorry, Mom, are called sons of bitches. We need to be reclaiming our time. In the current context, leadership blames citizens for their own infrastructure problems and is slow to send aid to the neediest citizens suffering from a natural disaster and engages in a Twitter war with any leader that questions the expedience of the support. A prime example of the fact that socioeconomic status continues to stratify us amongst other issues. We need to be reclaiming our time. In the current context, our transgender sisters and brothers are denied the basic human right of using the restroom that corresponds with their gender identity. In the current context, race and socioeconomic status intersect to produce vastly different outcomes for people. For instance, Brock Turner can be convicted of 3 counts of felony sexual assault and serve 3 months. And 16-year-old Khalif Browder can be imprisoned for 3 years without trial for allegedly stealing a backpack and spend most of that time in solitary confinement. We need to be reclaiming our time. In the current context, women have constantly received the message that they are second-class citizens in a variety of ways. And y'all can look at that picture and tell what's wrong with it. There's a lot wrong with it, but I'm talking about the sisters for just a minute. Women, though qualified, have never occupied the highest leadership position in the land. The gender pay gap is still pervasive, and men still have the power to legislate women's reproductive health care choices. We need to be reclaiming our time. In the current context, my husband and I, in spite of our fancy degrees and our nice neighborhood, are acutely aware that we, as well as other parents of color, must continually have to talk with our sons about how to engage with law enforcement and others so that a minor incident doesn't turn their lives into a hashtag. Now, let me stop right there. This slide is not representative fully. And as a qualitative researcher, I'll talk about my subjective bias here. So, 2 things. One, the slide only has black people on it, and you all, I'm sure, are well aware that this phenomenon does not just happen to black people, but other people of color, right? Shooting and killing of unarmed people. A lot is made of it in the news about black people, but I realize that that is not the only group that is faced with that issue. The other issue, though, and some people might be thinking, well, you know, April, you and your husband are law-abiding citizens, and y'all got all these degrees, and you can just teach your children to obey the law and be compliant. Sure, we can. And we would definitely tell our children to respect authority. That's not the issue, though. And so when we have the talk, what's problematic for me is, what do I tell them? And the reason why my subjective bias is invoked here is because not one of the people pictured here was actually involved with a crime or even suspected at the time that they were shot and killed. So you have little Ayanna Jones, who was asleep in her grandmother's on her grandmother's couch. You have Jordan Edwards, who was at a party, it got rowdy, and he did what his parents told him to do, come home. Cop shot into the car. Jordan Davis was at a gas station with his friends with the music bumping. None of us have ever done that. Tamir Rice was playing in the park in Ohio, which is an open carry state, because the commentary was he looked older. So, and John Crawford was at Walmart, and somebody lied on him, called the cops, and said he was waving a gun. So what talk do you have with your children? Because if the talk is just be compliant, be respectful, we can have that talk. My fear is that that's not enough, and I don't know what to tell them. We'll have to continually remind our little beautiful black boys that society may attempt to commodify their bodies, often through sport, but they won't be valued as people. I worry as a mother for my babies already. We need to be reclaiming our time. In the current context, the Second Amendment right to bear arms precludes any discussion of gun control. Mass murders are blamed on mental illness, which to me is curious since other countries with gun control laws surely have citizens who suffer from mental illness. And no place is sacred. Schools, universities, movie theaters are places of worship. In fact, it seems easier to buy a gun than to purchase allergy medicine. We need to be reclaiming our time. In the current context, leaders in Flint, Michigan conspired to a deal that poisoned the water with lead for poor citizens, lied to those citizens about the quality of the water, and have yet to fix the problem. And the effects of this have not yet been seen, and it's going to come into the schools, believe me, because these little babies are drinking this lead-infested water. We need to be reclaiming our time. In the current social and political context, it seems that the goal of the current administration is to dismantle all of the successful policies and promises of the previous administration, from the Affordable Care Act to the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals and many others. The educational leadership research informs us that as visionary leaders, we should be looking forward, not behind. We must reclaim our time. And so that's sort of the broader context, but let's talk about schools. Right? What's the context there? Where schools are a microcosm of society. And as such, schools have been the site of replication for many of the issues that I articulated that plague our current context. For instance, there are several schools and districts, and I know of one in Houston, where the leadership has decided to exclude athletes who take a knee during the playing of the national anthem. These children have followed the example of peaceful protests like some of their role models, but the school and district leadership have forgotten that in 1969, the Supreme Court ruled in Tinker v. Des Moines that, quote, students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. Schools are excluding African-American female students for eschewing white mainstream standards of beauty by wearing braids, locks, and other natural hairstyles. If you just Google black girls' natural hair and racism, you'll find so many examples where schools and where administrators have decided to suspend or expel or discipline in some way African-American female, and in some cases male, students because of their natural hairstyles. This confounds me. And let me just say this, I know we come in all kinds of shapes and colors and sizes and hair textures and all that, but most black people that you see, I'm telling y'all a little secret, with straight hair, we've done something to alter the natural, natural state of our hair. So if we add a little water to this right here, it's going to change. And that's my natural hair, and that should be acceptable. It's what comes out of my head unaltered. And yet it's not. And can you imagine if we, as schools, excluded a white female student because she chose to wear her hair in a natural state? We need to be reclaiming our time. More than a year of campaign rhetoric about immigrants led to reports of increased bullying of students. Many students live in fear of deportation. There's so many examples of that in the news, of their caretakers, of themselves being deported. And there have been several incidences in schools where students were chanting, "Build a wall," since the outcome of the elections. Needless to say, the stress of all this can take a toll on student academics and social interactions. And our LGBTQ students continue to be bullied in schools. School and district leaders grapple with basic issues like providing appropriate locker room and restroom facilities. The current administration has returned these decisions to the states, deciding to withdraw and rescind guidelines issued by the previous administration that required schools to allow transgender students specifically to use the restrooms matching their gender identity rather than their birth gender. In addition to the myriad challenges infiltrating schools from the larger social and political context, the demographics of schools is changing. And while the racial and ethnic diversity of school students has increased, the percentage of white and teachers and administrators have remained relatively constant. What has also remained relatively constant is the opportunity gaps that often influence student outcomes. The starkest evidence of this is the overrepresentation of black and brown students in exclusionary discipline, the underrepresentation of black and brown children in gifted AP and IB programs, the overrepresentation of black and brown children in special education, the underrepresentation of female students in STEM subjects, and the proliferation of the school-to-prison pipeline through the policing of black and brown student bodies. While there's movement in these areas, the structural oppression still exists. In the midst of this is individual student and families' experiences of this oppression and the ways in which this oppression and daily microaggressions then color their experiences of the educational system. Often this begins early and is pervasive. This amplifies the need for school and district leadership that is responsive to these needs. In light of all this and so much more, it is time to reclaim our time and enact elements of moral leadership. So leadership itself is the ability to influence people toward a goal. We know that. I'm talking to leadership folks. Leadership theories both describe and prescribe leaders' behavior, often in light of the skills or traits of the leader, the nature of the situation, and the development of the followers. Exemplary leader behavior is important because leaders serve as role models for followers and set norms and expectations that influence the thoughts and behaviors of followers. The leader's job in the midst of change is to facilitate the creation of a culture that influences things for the better. Moral leadership, though, both does also prescribe and describe the character and values of the leader in consideration of the situation and condition of those whom the leader serves. As a concept, moral leadership has its genesis in the field of nursing. Jarnison and LaSala describe moral leadership as the raising of collective and individual expectations, quote, communicating openly and honestly, being fair and trustworthy, and being proactive rather than reactive. James McGregor Burns describes moral leadership as, quote, less the 10 Commandments and more the Golden Rule. He states, moral leadership emerges from and always returns to the fundamental wants and needs and aspirations and values of the followers. Essentially, values are at the heart of leadership. In her 2003 UCEA presidential address, Gail Furman posited that leadership, quote, should be concerned with right and wrong, not with traits, behaviors, roles, and so on. In addition to these definitions I found in the literature, I see moral leadership as composed of 3 pillars or component parts. Effective moral leadership hinges on and is enacted at the nexus of a triumvirate of moral purpose, moral outrage, and moral courage. And so for the next short bit of time, I'd like to unpack each. So first we have moral purpose. And to me, this is the foundation of moral leadership. Purpose is the foundation for the work that we do. It is the vision to which we aspire. Furman states that moral purpose is, quote, the sense of purpose in our work as educators that fires the imagination and the heart and proceeds from a sense of duty and conscience that inspires, that lets us know we're doing something really important. Purpose-driven leaders are focused on helping those in the learning community cope with elusive and volatile matters while maintaining a vision and hope that transcends them. As I pondered the content for this address, I thought about the current political and social context and how those who engage in acts of resistance are challenged and often further oppressed. I also thought about my own experiences as a student, and then as a teacher, and then as a school leader. I thought about my passion and opinions about leadership and leadership development. I asked myself the questions that I'm now going to pose to each of you so that we're going to get a little bit interactive for just a second. The questions I asked myself are, why do I do this work? What tools do leaders need to be effective in doing this work? What makes it challenging? What is at the heart of our passion for the work that we do? And as you reflect on that, I want to share a story with you. But before we do that, I actually want to engage you. So I want you to think about, this is an activity I actually do with my students, and it is an April Peters Hawkins developed activity. I didn't borrow this. I borrowed some things, I didn't borrow this. I want you to think about the first time that you noticed that you or someone else was different, and that difference had a value. It was value-laden, right? It positioned you as privileged or not. I want you to think about, most of us have a very poignant experience that we can think about, but just for a second, think about that, and think about how old you were and where you were. We'll come back to that. Now, I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you my story, and then I want to ask you a few questions about your story. So I want to tell you the chocolate milk story. And I didn't write this story down because I know it really well. So remember I told you I went to this private school and then for 1 year, and then I went to public school for the very next year, and then I went back to the private school. So in that 1 year that I went to public school, I was a year younger than everyone else. So I was in 2nd grade in Mrs. Precious' class, and my mother stayed home. And I think, thinking back now, I realized there was a little bit of a socioeconomic stratification, because at lunchtime, the kids whose mommy stayed home sent them to school with a lunch, and you just had to buy milk. And the other kids, they went and got in the line to buy a school lunch. So I was in the go buy milk line, right? My mommy stayed home and made my lunch. And this is so long ago that milk was 10 cents. Yeah, it was like 100,000 years ago. So I'm in line behind a young little white girl, and her race is important for the story. And I will never forget her. Her name is Lauren Levitan. She's not here, is she? It's all good, Lauren, if you're here. So Lauren Levitan was in line in front of me, and she turns around and she looks and she sees the milk in my hand. I had a white milk in my hand. And she said, "Why are you buying that white milk?" And you have to understand the parents that I grew up with. They didn't let you do anything fun. So I couldn't drink the chocolate milk. And the purpose for that is because it has too much sugar, So I said, I was pretty rule-following kind of kid, so I said, well, I'm not allowed to drink the chocolate milk. And Lauren Levitan said to me, well, my mommy told me that white milk is for white people and chocolate milk is for chocolate people. Now, that's kind of a funny story 40 years later. But in that moment, my 6-year-old heart and mind understood a lot about race and racial oppression, right? Because her mommy told her that, right? Mommies have authority. They make the rules. And my mommy hadn't told me that. And the school I came from hadn't told me that I was a chocolate milk person. I was less than, because in my house, chocolate milk was no good for you. So she's telling me I'm no good. And I was 6, and it was in school. And you know how powerful that story was? I'm a lot older than 6, And I didn't forget where I was. I haven't forgotten her name. And I even know how much milk costed back then. And I've taken that with me ever since. And there have been lots of other situations. I mean, I told you the situation about tracking. But that was the first time that I understood that. Now, I want to ask you, because you all thought about your stories, and you were probably, having some sort of visceral reaction while I was sharing that. So let me ask you this question. And for this, you can't do this little thing that we do with our hands. You have to raise it up high, because I want to prove a point, and I want you to look around the room while we're proving this point, okay? So for how many of you did this scenario happen at home, where you realize difference? Okay, about 2 people, 3 people. For how many of you was it in your neighborhood or somewhere other than school or home? A couple more people. For how many of you was this at school when it happened? Look around the room. Just look around. Vast majority. For how many of you, the situation that you experienced informed you that you were in the privileged group? I want you to look around. Actually, I want you all to stand. You were the privileged group, stand. Sorry to put everybody on the spot. Look around and look what you notice about people's identity. We're all family here. We love each other, so it's all good. Okay, please sit down. For how many of you, you were not in the privileged group? Stand up. Also powerful. Please sit. Now, here's the real crux of the story for me. For those of you who were in school, or where, irrespective of where it is, you know about the correlation age to the grade level, right? So you know whether you were elementary school age, even if it didn't happen at school. For how many of you did this incident happen when you were elementary school aged? Look around. Middle school aged. Look around. High school aged. Look around. College aged. 1 person, 2 people. Outside of college, 1 person. Okay. That is powerful. That is telling you that, for one thing, these incidences are happening in school, primarily, for little kids. And it's shaping everything. So I told you who I am, and I said I'm the oldest, and I'm black, and I'm female, and I'm married, and all that. I didn't tell you this stuff because I knew I was getting to it, but it also is part of my identity, and everybody else who's walking around here is part of our identity. And as moral leaders, right, we have to understand this. And we also have to understand what our purpose is when we engage, right? How has that incident shaped all the rest of the things that you do? How has it informed your purpose? When I came to public school from the all-black private school, I was full of confidence and pride. I felt like a valued member of a community. I was loved. I felt important. Public school, integrated, stripped me of all of that. And I became invisible to my teachers. I was the wrong race. I lived in the wrong neighborhood. I told y'all that. My parents had the wrong pedigree. So ultimately, I do this work, and most people who answered said I was not in the privileged group, right? I do this work because I want all children, especially our most vulnerable ones, to feel confident. I want them to know we see them. I want them to know I love them. I want them to know that the world may not always value you, but you will be given exactly what you need to be successful. I do this work to help teachers and leaders to create the kind of culture that values all of the children. I do this work to change the world. That is my purpose. What is your purpose? How are you reclaiming your time? I'll leave you with that for the purpose part of this. The second element of the paradigm that I have about moral leadership is moral outrage. Moral outrage occurs as a response to perceived injustice. We feel moral outrage when we face situations that challenge our beliefs about what is right and fair and just. Moral outrage allows us to intercede on the behalf of others. Specifically, moral outrage is often expressed against a system or set of policies or practices that oppress or disadvantage others. Pike in 1991 defined moral outrage as an emotional response to the inability to carry out moral choices or decisions. Moral outrage is characterized by energy-draining frustration, anger, disgust, and a sense of powerlessness. But that's not all. It gets better. Those who exhibit moral outrage are often willing to put themselves on the line for others whom they feel are oppressed. The research admonishes us to be careful with moral outrage. That is, we must be careful to use our moral outrage powers for good. However, at the heart of the matter is, what ignites your righteous indignation? What issues of social justice and equity elicit a visceral reaction from you? How are they connected to your motivation or moral purpose? And I have to ask yourself there, because this is interactive, but it's sort of reflective, so we're not going to share that out, but I really want you to think about that. What is the source of my moral outrage? The current social and political context provides tremendous fertile ground for moral outrage. There's a saying, if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it. I believe if we, and this is sort of a double entendre here, I believe if we create and then celebrate historic monuments to our evil history, we have made our hellish history our painful present, and we have doomed ourselves. For those who live in the power minority, our existence is characterized by outrage. To quote James Baldwin, to be a Negro in the country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all of the time. However, we all should be outraged. As leaders, the inequities we see in schools, reinforced by structural oppression, should absolutely outrage us. We need to feel the righteous anger. Thus, moral outrage requires our indignation. Nobody has ever told you that. You got the right to be indignant. It requires us to be conscious. As leaders, it requires us to see and feel beyond our personal experience. So you have had those personal experiences, but now your outrage has to take you beyond that experience. It asks, what is right? And it requires us to connect passionately to reclaim our time. And then the third pillar of this is moral courage. And this has been defined and theorized by a number of scholars over time. For instance, it's been defined as a condition in which, quote, the personal agency required to act when faced with ethical challenges or threats is developed. Aristotle, because I want to get philosophical with y'all for just a second, suggested that moral courage must be evident in one's behavior, given that it is a means and an end. We're going to come back to that in a second. That is, moral courage is an aspect of character, quote, composed of habits which are formed through repetitious acts. Additional research defines moral courage at times as enacting the power to do nothing at all. The power to say no is also powerful. And finally, Sakirka and Bagazi define moral courage as the ability to use inner principles to do what is good for others, regardless of threat to self as a matter of practice. Moral courage requires leaders to behave ethically. Moral courage, quote, is thus critical in linking judgments to ethical action. Kidder and Bracey state, quote, moral courage plays itself out daily, hourly in the interstices of our lives. This suggests that we are, or should be, always already engaging in acts of moral courage. Moral courage is enacted when moral purpose and moral outrage align. I propose several steps to engage in acts of moral courage. These are just my musings, by no means exhaustive, but just some things I thought of. First, assume an unapologetic stance. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is action in spite of one's feelings of fear. It is confidence in what is right, even if you have trepidation about doing it. Dr. Lorraine Monroe, turnaround principal of Frederick Douglass Academy in Harlem and the author of the Monroe Doctrine, an ABC guide to what great bosses do, states, becoming a leader is an act of self-invention. Imagine yourself as a leader, act as if you were a leader until you actually become one. In a talk that I heard her give at the Fordham University Principal Institute many years ago, she paraphrased it this way, saying, this is theater. This reminds me of my own experience as an urban high school principal. In the midst of challenge and my own fear and stress, I was the leader. I had to lead. Sometimes I didn't feel like it. So as my parents would say, I had to fake it till I made it. Moral courageousness is not easy. If it were, everybody would do it. But if you are the leader, you must lead. In spite of your own anxieties and fear, your people need and deserve your unapologetic leadership. This is outrageous courageousness. I think another step is to create a lexicon that empowers people and places their humanity at the center. Words have meaning and power. I say that all the time. So you have to choose them carefully. Influence others in your sphere to choose them carefully as well. This has to be done while acknowledging that we live in a broader society that equates difference with a deficit, as evidenced in policies, practices, and language. These conflations are present in schools as well. In schools, we use value-laden language that positions that which is different from the dominant as other and necessarily less than. We do it all the time. For instance, we use words like disability instead of differently abled. Here's the one I love the most, subgroup. Y'all, we're going to talk about prefixes for a second. What does the prefix sub mean? Below, right? So we compare subgroups to the white students. So everybody else is below them. So we should use the word, in my classes, we are required to use the term demographic groups. Nobody's beneath anyone else. We use terms like disadvantaged or at risk instead of vulnerable students. Poor instead of people living in poverty. Minority instead of people of color. And the list goes on. So I encourage you to develop your own language of empowerment that decenters the dominant and honors humanity. Build an appropriate culture. Moral courage is most effective when it does not happen in a vacuum. We must teach our leaders to combine purpose with outrage to create a culture that supports moral courage. This should include not only those in the school and district context, but external stakeholders as well. When such a culture exists, then we will begin to dismantle structural oppression and create spaces where all students and adults can thrive. This is one of my favorites. Resist and advocate. Our scholarship and activism are potential sites for resistance. For many of us engaged in this work, our research agenda is our means of resistance and advocacy. Additionally, Dantley and Tillman inform us, our teaching can and should have a significant impact on the Leadership for Social Justice movement. Further, the ways in which we engage as public scholars is a way to inform and educate while resisting and advocating. And I've been very impressed with the way some of us really are engaged in that public scholarship. If we are going to develop leaders who have moral purpose and act courageously based on their moral outrage, we will have to teach them how to identify injustice, how to be appropriately responsive to such issues, and when necessary, engage in acts of resistance. And then, of course, very important, engage in self-care. Enacting moral leadership is in many ways emancipatory work, and it's exhausting. The current social and political context, the context of schools, the 24-hour news cycle can work together to contribute to a condition I call PTSD. Now, I was having this conversation with my husband one time, and I was like, I feel like I have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And he said, I don't know about that P because there's nothing post about it. So I thought about the P, and I say persistent traumatic stress disorder. It's happening all the time. This climate fosters a feeling of trauma for those whom it already oppresses and their allies. The burden is double for those of us who both experience the trauma and must lead and serve those who also suffer from this trauma. I've been encouraged by my husband to turn off CNN as a means of self-care. He said, I watch it too much. He's right. Sometimes being active on social media is self-care. Sometimes shutting it off is self-care. I believe we can only sustain this work if we provide ourselves the space to unplug from time to time in order to recharge and re-energize. So ultimately, moral courage requires action. It compels our behavior. To be morally courageous leaders, or to develop moral courage in the leaders we serve, we should be engaged in action. In other words, don't just stand there, take a knee. So, let's talk about my conclusion. These are my concluding remarks about reclaiming our time. I began this talk by sharing a personal instance of structural oppression in my own experience as a student. I shared my personal stories because for me and so many others, the personal is political. The current social and political climate seriously influences what happens to us personally. Our current political climate is one that often seems bereft of civility, of communal investment, of political correctness, of social justice or fairness. And given that schools are microcosms of society, leaders have a challenging task. We who operate at the center of knowledge production, if there's such a term, that term is a little bit problematic for me, but we're just going to leave it there for now. We must understand that, quote, it is actively immoral for school leaders to attempt to embrace any genre of administration without first grappling with the social, political, and cultural context in which their schools exist. That's the same quote from Michael Dantley that I gave you earlier. I'm bringing it home. In my paradigm, moral leadership has three elements. First, leaders, meaning those of us in this room and those aspiring leaders with whom we work, must identify our purpose, our personal history, our answer to the question, why, your chocolate milk story. And we have to connect that to the broader vision we have of leadership. We must understand that, quote, purpose-driven leaders use critique and possibility as the motivations for their work. Second, we must acknowledge our indignation or our outrage. David Purple posits that moral outrage is, quote, absolute requisite to serious efforts at cultural and educational transformation. That's deep. In order to change things, we actually have to engage in that moral outrage. Outrage is the motivation we need to make change for the better in our schools. We must clearly identify our righteous indignation if we are to be effective leaders for social justice. David Purple goes on to state, quote, the most powerful element that is lacking for the kind of transformation that is necessary to renew our commitments is a sense of profound moral outrage. And finally, we must do something. Moral courage requires consistent exercising of habits of the heart. We must have the courage to be servant leaders who minister to the needs of others, the courage to be ethical leaders who operate with integrity, the courage to be transformational leaders who influence others around them to a greater good, the courage to be transformative leaders who engage in critical reflection and, as Shields said, quote, create learning contexts in which social, political, and cultural capital is enhanced to provide equity of opportunity for students. The current social and political context provides what Michael Fullan calls the moral imperative for leadership. We must be always already engaged in the work because, as Jeffrey Canada reminded us during last year's Mid-Stifer lecture, quote, the most important time in our kids' lives is right now. As leaders and developers of leaders dedicated to social justice, we must commit to reclaiming our time. Everything depends on it. Thank you. Thank you all. Sorry? I don't think so. I am assuming that we are concluded at this point. That's all I got. Mic drop. Do you want to come up? I'll turn it over to Michelle. No, I'm not turning it over to Michelle. Thank you.